Who was Ishmael's wife? It's a question that has intrigued scholars and believers for centuries. Most people know the story of Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar. They remember how Ishmael was born to Hagar in the wilderness, how he became the father of 12 princes, and how his descendants would become a great nation. But here's what's fascinating. The Bible tells us that Hagar found a wife for Ishmael from the land of Egypt, yet it never tells us her name. It never describes who she was or what role she played in shaping the destiny of nations. What if I told you that this unnamed woman holds the key to understanding one of history's most significant genealogical mysteries? What if her identity and her story could unlock the hidden connections between ancient biblical prophecy and the rise of entire civilizations? Today, we're about to embark on a journey that will take us deep into the sands of time, through ancient texts, rabbinical traditions, and historical records that most people have never encountered. You see, this isn't just about one woman's identity. This is about the foundation of Arab nations, the roots of tribal confederations that would shape Middle Eastern politics for millennia, and the prophetic fulfillment of promises made to Abraham thousands of years ago. By the end of this exploration, you'll understand why the silence surrounding Ishmael's wife might be one of the most significant omissions in biblical narrative, and how her story connects directly to events that are still unfolding in our world today. If you're ready to uncover truths that have been hidden in plain sight for generations, drop a Y in the comments. And make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because what we're about to reveal will challenge everything you thought you knew about biblical genealogy and the origins of entire civilizations. Trust me, this journey will take you places you never expected to go. Let's begin by stepping back into the ancient world, to a moment that would change the course of history forever. Picture this: Abraham, the father of faith, standing in the wilderness with his beloved son Isaac. But this isn't the only son Abraham had. Years earlier, when Sarah was barren and hope seemed lost, she had given her Egyptian maidservant Hagar to Abraham. From this union came Ishmael, a boy whose very name means God hears. The Lord had heard Hagar's cry in the wilderness, and he had made promises about this child that would echo through the ages. In Genesis 17, God speaks directly to Abraham about Ishmael's destiny. And as for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him, and will make him fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. He shall beget 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. 12 princes, a great nation. These weren't just poetic words or symbolic language. This was a divine decree that would literally reshape the geography of the ancient world. But here's where the story takes a fascinating turn. After Sarah gives birth to Isaac, tensions arise in Abraham's household. The Bible tells us in Genesis 21 that Sarah sees Ishmael mocking, and she demands that Abraham send both Hagar and Ishmael away. It's a heart-wrenching moment. Abraham is distressed because Ishmael is his son, his flesh and blood. But God reassures him, do not let it be displeasing in your sight because of the lad or because of your bondwoman. Whatever Sarah has said to you, listen to her voice. For in Isaac your seed shall be called. Yet I will also make a nation of the son of the bondwoman, because he is your seed. Early the next morning, Abraham gives Hagar bread and a skin of water, and sends her away with the child. They wander in the wilderness of Beersheba until the water runs out. Hagar, believing her son is about to die, places him under a shrub and walks away because she cannot bear to watch him perish. But then something miraculous happens. The angel of God calls to Hagar from heaven. What ails you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is. Arise, lift up the lad and hold him with your hand, for I will make him a great nation. God opens Hagar's eyes, and she sees a well of water. They drink, they survive, and young Ishmael grows up in the wilderness of Paran. The text tells us he becomes an archer, skilled with the bow. And then comes the crucial verse that sets the stage for our entire investigation. So he dwelt in the wilderness of Paran. and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. One sentence, 22 words in English. And yet, embedded within this brief statement lies the foundation for understanding how Ishmael's descendants would indeed become princes and how they would influence the course of Middle Eastern history for thousands of years. Think about this carefully. Hagar was Egyptian. She had connections, family, cultural ties to one of the most powerful civilizations of the ancient world. When she chose a wife for her son, she wasn't making a random selection. She was making a strategic alliance. She was connecting Ishmael to Egyptian nobility, to Egyptian resources, to Egyptian influence. Some rabbinical traditions even suggest that Hagar herself was a daughter of Pharaoh, which would make Ishmael's marriage an even more significant political union. But who was this Egyptian woman? What was her name? What was her background? And why does the Bible remain completely silent about her identity when it meticulously records the genealogies of so many other biblical figures? Here's where ancient traditions begin to fill in the gaps that Scripture leaves open. In Jewish rabbinical literature, particularly in a text called Perk to Rabbi Eliezer, we encounter stories that have been passed down through generations about Abraham's relationship with his son Ishmael, even after their separation. These aren't just random tales. They're carefully preserved traditions that attempt to understand the deeper connections between biblical characters and their historical significance. According to these traditions, Abraham didn't simply abandon Ishmael in the wilderness and forget about him. Instead, he maintained a relationship with his firstborn son, visiting him periodically and even influencing major decisions in his life, including his choice of wives. Yes, wives plural. The traditions speak of Ishmael having not one, but two wives, and the story of how he came to marry them reveals something profound about the development of Arab tribal culture and the fulfillment of God's promises. The first wife, according to these accounts, was chosen by Hagar from among her Egyptian connections. But this marriage didn't work out as planned. When Abraham came to visit his son and found him away hunting, he encountered this first wife. Through a series of questions about hospitality, food, and water, Abraham tested her character. Her responses revealed someone who was inhospitable, complainful, and unsuited to be the wife of a man destined to father princes. Abraham left a cryptic message for Ishmael. "Tell your husband to change the threshold of his door." When Ishmael returned and heard this message, he immediately understood his father's meaning. The threshold of a house represents its foundation, its beginning point, its entrance into a new life. Abraham was telling his son to change his wife, to start over, to build his family on a different foundation. And that's exactly what Ishmael did. He divorced his first wife and married again, this time choosing more carefully. The second wife, according to tradition, came from a different background entirely. Some sources say she was from the Jurhum tribe, an Arabic-speaking people who had settled near the sacred valley where Mecca would later be established. Others provide specific names that are remarkably significant: Aisha and Fatima. Now here's where this story becomes absolutely fascinating. These names, Aisha and Fatima, are identical to the names of Muhammad's wife and daughter. Think about the implications of this. Either these traditions preserve ancient historical names that by pure coincidence match the most important women in early Islamic history, or there's something much deeper going on here. These names might represent a prophetic foreshadowing, a divine orchestration that connects Ishmael's lineage directly to the emergence of Islam centuries later. But we can't stop there, because the story of Ishmael's wives connects to an even larger narrative about the development of Arab identity, the emergence of tribal confederations, and the fulfillment of biblical prophecy in ways that most people have never considered. Remember those 12 princes that God promised? They weren't just symbolic figures. They became real tribal leaders with real names, real territories, and real influence. The Bible actually lists them: Nebaioth, Kedar, Adbeel, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadad, Tama, Jeter, Naphish, and Kadima. These names weren't just entries in an ancient genealogical record. They represented actual tribal confederations that would control trade routes, influence political alliances, and shape the economic landscape of the ancient Middle East. Take Nebaioth, for example. Historical records connect him directly to the Nabateans, one of the most successful trading peoples of the ancient world. These weren't desert nomads scratching out a bare existence. These were sophisticated merchants who controlled the incense trade, built magnificent cities like Petra, and accumulated wealth that rivaled established empires. The Jewish historian Josephus explicitly identified the Nabateans with Nebaioth, Ishmael's firstborn son. Or consider Kedar, Ishmael's second son. The Kedarites became the dominant Arab tribal confederation of their era. They were renowned as warriors, particularly as archers, and they controlled major commercial routes throughout northern Arabia. Assyrian records document their military encounters with these tribes, referring to them as formidable opponents who challenged even the mighty Assyrian Empire. This isn't mythology or legend, this is documented history. Ancient Assyrian inscriptions from the reigns of Tiglath-Pileser III and Sennacherib specifically mention the Nabatu, likely descendants of Nebaioth, and the Kedarites as significant political and military forces in the Arabian Peninsula. They weren't marginal desert tribes. They were major players in ancient Middle Eastern politics. But here's what makes this story even more compelling: the role that Ishmael's marriage choices played in establishing these tribal confederations and their eventual rise to prominence. When Hagar chose an Egyptian wife for her son, she was connecting him to one of the most advanced civilizations of her time. When Ishmael later married into Arabic-speaking tribes, he was positioning his descendants to become cultural bridges between different peoples and different worlds. The implications of these marriage alliances extend far beyond personal relationships. They represent the foundation of cultural exchange, the establishment of trade networks, and the development of political structures that would influence the course of history for millennia. Ishmael's wives weren't just women who bore him children. They were the mothers of nations, the foundational figures whose influence would ripple through generations of tribal leaders, merchants, warriors, and eventually, prophets. And this brings us to one of the most significant aspects of this entire story: the connection between Ishmael's lineage and the emergence of Islam. According to Islamic tradition, the Prophet Muhammad traced his ancestry directly back to Ishmael through a line that included Adnan, a descendant of Kedar. This isn't just religious mythology. This represents a carefully maintained genealogical tradition that connects the founding of Islam to the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham about Ishmael becoming a great nation. But let's pause here for a moment and consider something that most people completely overlook. The traditional narrative we've been exploring represents just one layer of a much more complex historical tapestry. When we dig deeper into ancient sources, when we examine archaeological evidence, when we trace linguistic patterns and cultural exchanges, a different picture begins to emerge. One that challenges some assumptions while confirming others in ways that are absolutely stunning. You see, the question of Ishmael's wife isn't just about identifying a biblical character. It's about understanding how ancient marriage practices created the foundation for entire civilizations. In the ancient Near East, marriage wasn't simply a personal choice between two individuals. It was a political strategy, an economic alliance, a cultural bridge that could determine the fate of tribes and nations for generations. When Hagar chose that first Egyptian wife for Ishmael, she was operating according to customs that we can trace through multiple ancient sources. Egyptian royal families regularly formed marriage alliances with neighboring peoples to secure trade routes, establish political stability, and extend their influence throughout the region. If rabbinical traditions are correct that Hagar herself was connected to Pharaoh's household, then Ishmael's first marriage would have represented a significant diplomatic union. But here's where the story becomes fascinating from a historical perspective. Ancient texts describe how Abraham continued to monitor and influence his son's life, even after their physical separation. The account of Abraham's visits to Ishmael reveals something profound about patriarchal authority and family relationships in the ancient world. When Abraham arrived at Ishmael's dwelling and found his son away hunting, his interaction with Ishmael's wife wasn't casual conversation. It was a formal evaluation, a test of character and suitability. The questions Abraham asked reveal the criteria that mattered most in ancient Arabian society. He inquired about hospitality, about food and water, about the basic courtesies that define civilized behavior in a harsh desert environment. When Ishmael's first wife responded with complaints about their circumstances, when she failed to offer the most basic hospitality to a stranger, she wasn't just being rude. She was demonstrating that she lacked the fundamental qualities needed to be the mother of princes. Abraham's message to change the threshold of his door carried layers of meaning that go far beyond simple marriage advice. In ancient Middle Eastern culture, the threshold represented the transition between the outer world and the inner sanctuary of family life. It symbolized the foundation upon which a household was built, the values that would be passed down to children, the character that would define a lineage. When Abraham told Ishmael to change his threshold, he was instructing him to rebuild his family on a completely different foundation. And that's exactly what happened. Ishmael divorced his first wife and married again, but the second marriage represented something entirely different. Instead of connecting to Egyptian nobility, he married into the Jurhum tribe, an Arabic-speaking people who had settled in the region that would later become sacred to millions of people worldwide. The Jurhum were not random desert nomads. They were sophisticated tribal people who controlled water sources, understood trade networks, and possessed cultural knowledge that would prove invaluable for Ishmael's descendants. According to Islamic tradition, it was through his interaction with the Jurhum that Ishmael himself learned to speak Arabic fluently, transitioning from whatever language he had spoken as a child to becoming one of the foundational figures in Arabic linguistic development. Think about the implications of this linguistic transformation. Language isn't just communication. It's culture, identity, worldview, and connection to community. When Ishmael learned Arabic from the Jurhum, he wasn't just acquiring a new skill. He was becoming integrated into a cultural system that would shape the identity of his descendants for millennia. But we need to examine this story with critical eyes as well. Modern scholarship has raised important questions about the traditional connections between Ishmael and Arab peoples. Some historians argue that the association between Ishmael and the Arabs was a later development, influenced by political and religious motivations rather than historical accuracy. They point out that biblical references to Ishmaelites and Arabs appear to be separated by centuries, suggesting that these were distinct peoples rather than connected lineages. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century CE, was apparently the first to explicitly connect Ishmael with Arab peoples. In his Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus stated that Ishmael was the founder of the Arabian nation and that Abraham was their father. This connection then passed into Christian historical consciousness and eventually influenced early Islamic traditions about genealogy and tribal identity. But here's what's remarkable. Whether we accept the traditional genealogical connections or view them as later mythological developments, the historical impact remains undeniable. The 12 sons of Ishmael mentioned in Genesis correspond to tribal names and territorial designations that appear consistently in ancient Assyrian, Babylonian, and other historical records. These weren't fictional characters or symbolic representations. They were real tribal leaders whose descendants played significant roles in ancient Middle Eastern politics and commerce. Consider the archaeological evidence. Ancient inscriptions from multiple civilizations mention tribal confederations, whose names closely match the biblical list of Ishmael's sons. The Kedarites appear in Assyrian royal annals as formidable opponents who controlled crucial trade routes. The Nabateans, connected to Nebaioth, built one of the most successful commercial empires of the ancient world, with architectural achievements that still amaze visitors to places like Petra today. These tribal confederations weren't isolated groups struggling for survival in harsh desert conditions. They were sophisticated political and economic entities that understood international trade, diplomatic relations, and military strategy. They controlled the incense routes that connected the Arabian Peninsula to Mediterranean markets. They managed water resources in ways that supported substantial populations. They developed artistic and architectural traditions that influenced regional culture for centuries. And at the heart of these developments were marriage alliances that connected different peoples, different cultures, and different economic systems. When Ishmael married his second wife from the Jurhum tribe, he wasn't just choosing a personal companion. He was establishing the foundation for cultural synthesis that would enable his descendants to bridge different worlds. The names associated with Ishmael's wives in various traditions provide fascinating insights into this cultural bridging. Whether we're talking about Egyptian connections through his first wife or Arabic integration through his second wife, these marriages represented the kind of strategic alliances that created the conditions for tribal confederation and regional influence. Some traditions preserve the names Aisha and Fatima for Ishmael's wives, names that would later become central to Islamic history. Whether these represent historically accurate preservation of ancient names or prophetic foreshadowing of future developments, they illustrate the complex ways that genealogical traditions connect past, present, and future in Middle Eastern cultural consciousness. The linguistic implications alone are staggering. If Ishmael indeed learned Arabic through his marriage connections with the Jurhum tribe, then his wives played a crucial role in one of history's most significant linguistic developments. Arabic would eventually become the language of the Quran, the medium through which Islamic civilization would preserve and transmit knowledge from Greek, Persian, Indian, and other cultures during the medieval period. But we also need to consider the broader prophetic framework within which these marriages occurred. God's promise to Abraham about Ishmael becoming a great nation wasn't just about population growth or territorial expansion. It involved the development of political structures, economic systems, and cultural institutions that would enable sustained regional influence. The 12 princes mentioned in Genesis weren't just tribal chieftains. They represented the establishment of what we might call proto-states, organized political entities capable of conducting diplomacy, managing resources, and projecting power across significant geographical areas. The archaeological record confirms that descendants of these tribal confederations built cities, established trade networks, and created cultural institutions that lasted for centuries. And this brings us back to the central mystery. Why does the Bible remain silent about the specific identity of Ishmael's wife or wives? Given the detailed genealogical records preserved for other biblical figures, given the obvious historical significance of Ishmael's descendants, why would Scripture omit such crucial information? Perhaps the silence itself is the message. Perhaps by not naming Ishmael's wives, the biblical narrative is directing our attention towards something more important than individual identity. Perhaps it's emphasizing the role of divine providence in shaping historical outcomes, regardless of human names or personal details. Or perhaps the silence reflects the complex cultural dynamics of the ancient world, where women's identities were often subsumed into their roles as wives and mothers, even when their influence on historical developments was profound and lasting. What we can say with confidence is that Ishmael's marriages, whether to one wife or multiple wives, whether to Egyptians or Arabs or both, created the foundational relationships that enabled the fulfillment of God's promise about 12 princes and a great nation. The historical record confirms that tribal confederations tracing their ancestry to Ishmael's sons became major players in ancient Middle Eastern politics and commerce. These weren't marginal desert tribes scratching out a bare existence. They were sophisticated political and economic entities that understood how to navigate the complex world of ancient international relations. They built cities, controlled trade routes, accumulated wealth, and influenced the development of regional culture in ways that continued for millennia. And as we trace these historical threads forward through time, something absolutely remarkable begins to emerge. The tribal confederations that grew from Ishmael's lineage didn't simply fade into historical obscurity. Instead, they became the foundation for one of history's most significant religious and cultural transformations. Consider what happened in the centuries following the establishment of these 12 tribal principalities. The descendants of Kedar, Ishmael's second son, maintained their prominence as the dominant Arab confederation throughout the pre-Islamic period. Ancient records from multiple civilizations consistently reference their political influence, their control of commercial routes, and their military capabilities. But here's what's truly fascinating. It was from this very lineage that Islamic tradition claims the Prophet Muhammad descended. According to carefully maintained Arab genealogical records, Muhammad traced his ancestry back through 21 generations to Adnan, who was considered a descendant of Kedar. This isn't just religious mythology or wishful thinking. This represents a sophisticated system of tribal record-keeping that preserved lineage, information across centuries of political upheaval and social transformation. Think about the implications of this genealogical claim. If accurate, it means that God's promise to Abraham about Ishmael becoming a great nation found its ultimate fulfillment not just in tribal confederation or commercial success, but in the emergence of a religious movement that would eventually encompass over 1 billion people worldwide. But let's examine this claim with the scrutiny it deserves. The genealogical connection between Muhammad and Ishmael through Adnan represents one of the most debated topics in Middle Eastern historical scholarship. Some historians accept the traditional accounts as preserving authentic tribal memory. Others argue that these genealogical claims were developed or modified after the rise of Islam to provide religious legitimacy for Arab political and cultural dominance. What makes this debate particularly intriguing is the way it intersects with our original question about Ishmael's wife. You see, the specific tribal affiliations that developed from Ishmael's marriages created the cultural and political framework within which these later genealogical claims would be made and evaluated. The Jurhum tribe, into which tradition says Ishmael married, played a crucial role in the pre-Islamic history of Mecca. According to Islamic historical accounts, the Jurhum were the guardians of the sacred well of Zamzam and the custodians of the area that would later house the Kaaba. When Hagar and baby Ishmael were miraculously provided with water in the wilderness, it was members of the Jurhum tribe who first encountered them and offered protection and companionship. This encounter wasn't just a chance meeting between desert travelers. It represented the beginning of a cultural synthesis that would have profound historical consequences. The Jurhum brought Arabic language and cultural traditions. Ishmael brought the legacy of Abrahamic monotheism and the divine promise of greatness. The fusion of these elements created something entirely new, an Arabic-speaking people with connections to Abrahamic religious traditions. But we need to dig deeper into what this cultural fusion actually meant in practical terms. When Ishmael learned Arabic from the Jurhum, he wasn't just acquiring vocabulary and grammar. He was absorbing a complete worldview, a way of understanding relationships between tribes, methods of desert survival, systems of honor and hospitality, and approaches to commerce and diplomacy that had been refined over generations of Arabian life. At the same time, Ishmael brought something that the Jurhum had never encountered: direct personal connection to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This wasn't abstract theological knowledge or inherited religious tradition. This was living memory of divine encounters, miraculous provisions, and prophetic promises that had been fulfilled in his own lifetime. Consider the profound implications of this cultural exchange. The Jurhum gained access to monotheistic religious concepts that would later influence the development of Arabian spirituality. Ishmael gained integration into tribal systems that would enable his descendants to survive and thrive in one of the world's most challenging environments. The marriage that facilitated this exchange wasn't just a personal relationship between two individuals. It was the foundation for a new type of Arabian identity that combined the practical wisdom of desert, tribal culture with the spiritual insights of Abrahamic religion. This synthesis helps explain something that has puzzled historians for generations: how Arabian tribal confederations maintained certain monotheistic elements, even during periods when polytheistic practices dominated the region. Archaeological evidence from pre-Islamic Arabia reveals religious concepts and practices that seem to preserve echoes of Abrahamic traditions, even among peoples who had adopted complex polytheistic systems. Some scholars argue that these monotheistic elements represent the persistence of Ishmaelite religious influence, transmitted through generations of tribal memory and cultural practice. Others suggest that they reflect later religious development influenced by Jewish and Christian communities in the Arabian Peninsula. But here's what's remarkable about the traditional accounts of Ishmael's marriages. They provide a plausible mechanism for understanding how monotheistic religious concepts could have been preserved and transmitted within Arabian tribal culture across centuries of political and social change. The story becomes even more compelling when we examine the role that Ishmael's descendants played in the development of Meccan religious and commercial life. According to Islamic tradition, it was Ishmael who helped Abraham construct the Kaaba, the sacred structure that would become the focal point of Arabian pilgrimage and worship for centuries before the emergence of Islam. Whether we accept this tradition as historically accurate or view it as later mythological development, it illustrates the way that Ishmael's lineage became connected to the most important religious site in pre-Islamic Arabia. The Kaaba wasn't just a local shrine. It was the center of a pilgrimage system that brought together tribes from throughout the Arabian Peninsula, creating opportunities for cultural exchange, commercial activity, and political negotiation. The management of this pilgrimage system required sophisticated organizational capabilities, diplomatic skills, and religious authority. The tribal confederations that controlled Meccan religious life needed to be able to guarantee safe passage for pilgrims, mediate disputes between different tribal groups, and maintain the sacred status of the pilgrimage site itself. These weren't simple desert nomads scraping by in harsh conditions. These were skilled administrators managing one of the ancient world's most complex logistical operations. The annual pilgrimage to Mecca involved coordinating the movement of thousands of people across dangerous terrain, providing food and water for massive temporary populations, and maintaining security for valuable trade caravans that accompanied the religious travelers. The success of this system depended on the kind of intertribal cooperation and cultural synthesis that Ishmael's marriages had helped establish centuries earlier. The Egyptian connections through his first wife provided links to advanced administrative techniques and commercial practices. The Jurham connections through his second wife provide a deep understanding of Arabian tribal customs and desert survival skills. By the time we reach the 6th century CE, the descendants of these marriage alliances had created one of the ancient world's most successful examples of religious and commercial integration. Mecca had become not just a pilgrimage destination, but also a major commercial hub that connected trade routes between the Byzantine Empire, the Persian Empire, the Ethiopian highlands, and the Indian Ocean trading system. The Quraysh tribe, which controlled Meccan religious and commercial life during this period, claimed a direct descent from Ishmael through Adnan and Keter. Whether this genealogical claim represents historical accuracy or later mythological development, it illustrates how Ishmael's legacy had become central to Arabian cultural identity and political legitimacy. But here's where our investigation takes another fascinating turn. The success of the Meccan system created the conditions for religious and social tensions that would eventually lead to the emergence of Islam. The integration of diverse tribal groups, commercial interests, and religious traditions had produced unprecedented prosperity and cultural sophistication. But it had also created inequalities, conflicts, and spiritual questions that existing systems couldn't adequately address. Into this complex environment came Muhammad, claiming descent from Ishmael through the Quraysh tribal lineage. His religious message addressed many of the social and spiritual tensions that had developed within the Meccan system. His emphasis on monotheism resonated with Abrahamic traditions that had been preserved within Arabian tribal culture. His concern for social justice spoke to inequalities that had emerged from commercial success. The initial resistance to Muhammad's message came primarily from tribal leaders who benefited from existing religious and commercial arrangements. But his eventual success suggests that his religious vision addressed real needs and authentic spiritual longings that had developed within Arabian society. The connection between Muhammad's religious message and the legacy of Ishmael wasn't just genealogical. It was theological, cultural, and social. Islam claimed to represent the restoration of authentic, Abrahamic monotheism that had been corrupted by both Jewish and Christian developments and by Arabian polytheistic practices. This claim positioned Islam not as a new religion, but as the recovery of humanity's original spiritual condition. According to Islamic teaching, Adam, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad were all prophets of the same essential religious message. The differences between their communities represented human corruption of divine revelation rather than legitimate religious development. From this perspective, Ishmael's role in Islamic history wasn't just as an ancestor of Arab peoples. He was a crucial link in the chain of prophetic revelation that connected Adam to Muhammad. His preservation of Abrahamic monotheism within Arabian tribal culture created the foundation for Islam's eventual emergence and success. But we need to examine these claims with appropriate historical skepticism. The connection between Ishmael and Muhammad involves genealogical traditions that span over 2 millennia. Even sophisticated record-keeping systems would struggle to maintain accuracy across such extended time periods, especially given the political upheavals and social transformations that affected Arabian society during this era. Modern genetic research has added another layer of complexity to these questions. Studies of Middle Eastern population genetics suggest patterns of migration and cultural exchange that don't always align with traditional genealogical claims. While these studies can't definitively resolve questions about specific individuals like Ishmael or Muhammad, they do provide broader context for understanding how populations moved and mixed throughout the region. What emerges from this research is a picture of the Arabian Peninsula as a crossroads of human migration and cultural exchange, rather than an isolated region inhabited by genetically or culturally homogeneous populations. The peoples who became known as Arabs represented the synthesis of multiple ancestral traditions, rather than the descendants of any single founding figure. This genetic and archaeological evidence doesn't necessarily contradict traditional accounts of Ishmael's role in Arabian history, but it does suggest that the story is more complex than simple genealogical descent from a single ancestral couple. The marriages of Ishmael, whether to one wife or multiple wives, whether to Egyptians or Arabs or both, represented participation in ongoing processes of cultural exchange and synthesis that had been shaping Arabian society for millennia. His significance lies not in being the sole ancestor of Arab peoples, but in being a crucial participant in the cultural and religious developments that created the conditions for Arabian tribal confederation and eventual Islamic expansion. The question of his wife's identity remains mysterious precisely because it represents something larger than individual biography. It represents the complex processes through which ancient peoples formed alliances, exchanged cultural knowledge, and created new forms of social and political organization. The silence of scripture regarding her name might reflect the limitations of ancient record-keeping systems that focused on male lineages while minimizing female contributions. Or it might represent a deliberate literary choice that directs attention toward divine providence rather than human personalities. What we can say with confidence is that Ishmael's marriages, whatever their specific details, created the foundation for tribal confederations that played major roles in ancient Middle Eastern history. These confederations controlled trade routes, influenced political developments, and preserved cultural and religious traditions that would eventually contribute to one of history's most significant religious transformations. The story of Ishmael's wife, mysterious as it remains, connects directly to questions about cultural identity, religious development, and historical change that continue to shape our world today. Understanding her role, even when we cannot know her name, helps us appreciate the complex processes through which ancient promises find fulfillment in ways that no human participants could have anticipated or planned. As we prepare to explore the final dimensions of this mystery, consider how the threads we've been tracing connect to contemporary questions about Middle Eastern politics, religious identity, and cultural exchange. The ancient world that produced Ishmael's marriages continues to influence our modern world in ways that most people never fully appreciate. The implications of this ancient story reach far beyond historical curiosity. They touch the very heart of how we understand identity, destiny, and the mysterious ways that divine purposes unfold through human choices across generations. Today, as we witness ongoing tensions and conflicts throughout the Middle East, we're actually seeing the continuation of dynamics that began with those ancient marriage alliances in the wilderness of Paran. The tribal confederations that emerged from Ishmael's lineage didn't simply vanish into the dustbin of history. They evolved, adapted, and transformed, but their influence continues to shape political boundaries, cultural identities, and religious movements that affect billions of people worldwide. Consider the remarkable persistence of tribal identity throughout Arabian society, even in our modern era. Despite centuries of political change, foreign conquest, and social transformation, many contemporary Arab families maintain detailed genealogical records that trace their ancestry back through dozens of generations. These aren't just family curiosities or romantic attachments to the past. They represent living connections to ancient systems of honor, obligation, and identity that continue to influence contemporary behavior and decision-making. The marriage patterns that began with Ishmael's wives established precedents for strategic alliance building that we can still observe in modern Middle Eastern politics. When contemporary Arab leaders arrange marriages between their families, when they form political coalitions based on tribal affiliations, when they invoke genealogical connections to legitimize their authority, they're participating in cultural traditions that stretch back to those ancient decisions made by Hagar in choosing her son's bride. But we need to understand something crucial here. The significance of Ishmael's marriages extends far beyond the Arab world. The 12 tribal confederations that emerged from his lineage created a cultural and political framework that influenced the entire ancient Middle East. Their control of trade routes affected commercial development from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. Their military capabilities influenced the strategic calculations of major empires from Assyria to Rome. When we read about conflicts between these Ishmaelite confederations and the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, we're not just encountering ancient military history. We're seeing the unfolding of complex relationships between peoples who shared common ancestry through Abraham, but had developed different cultural and religious traditions through their respective histories. The tension between Isaac's descendants and Ishmael's descendants wasn't simply about territorial disputes or economic competition. It reflected deeper questions about divine favor, covenant promises, and the meaning of chosenness that continue to influence contemporary Middle Eastern conflicts. Think about this carefully. When modern political leaders invoke religious justifications for their policies, when they claim divine sanction for their territorial ambitions, when they appeal to ancient promises and prophetic fulfillments, they're drawing on interpretive traditions that connect directly to the story of Abraham's two sons and their respective destinies. The mystery of Ishmael's wife becomes even more significant when we consider how it connects to contemporary debates about religious authority and prophetic legitimacy. The genealogical claims that link Muhammad to Ishmael through carefully maintained tribal records represent more than historical curiosity. They provide the foundation for Islamic claims about the restoration of authentic, Abrahamic religion and the universal validity of Muhammad's prophetic message. But here's what makes this particularly fascinating from a contemporary perspective. The same genealogical traditions that support Islamic claims about Muhammad's descent from Ishmael also preserve detailed information about the broader tribal confederations that emerged from the 12 princes mentioned in Genesis. These records describe complex networks of alliance and conflict, cooperation and competition that shaped Arabian society for centuries before the emergence of Islam. Modern archaeological research has confirmed many details from these traditional accounts. Ancient inscriptions, trade documents, and diplomatic records from multiple civilizations provide independent verification of tribal names, territorial boundaries, and political relationships that match the genealogical traditions preserved in Arab historical sources. This convergence of traditional accounts and archaeological evidence suggests that the mystery of Ishmael's wife reflects real historical processes rather than pure mythology or religious imagination. The marriages that established tribal confederations in ancient Arabia created political and cultural institutions that left lasting marks on the historical record. The economic implications alone are staggering. The control of incense routes that connected South Arabian production centers to Mediterranean markets generated wealth that supported sophisticated urban centers, monumental architecture, and artistic achievements that rival anything produced by contemporary civilizations. The Nabateans, traditionally connected to Ishmael's eldest son Nebaioth, built commercial networks that extended from the Red Sea to Damascus, creating one of the ancient world's most successful examples of merchant capitalism. These weren't simple desert traders moving small quantities of luxury goods on camelback. They were sophisticated international businessmen managing complex supply chains, maintaining diplomatic relationships with multiple empires, and developing financial instruments that facilitated long-distance commerce across dangerous and politically unstable regions. The organizational capabilities required for this level of commercial success depended on the kind of intertribal cooperation and cultural synthesis that Ishmael's marriages had helped establish. The Egyptian connections provided access to advanced administrative techniques and international diplomatic networks. The Arabian connections provided deep knowledge of desert navigation, tribal customs, and the religious traditions that legitimized commercial and political authority. When we examine contemporary Middle Eastern business practices, we can still observe patterns that reflect these ancient precedents. The emphasis on personal relationships, the importance of family connections, the role of hospitality in commercial negotiations, the integration of religious observance with business activity, all of these contemporary characteristics can be traced back to cultural traditions that were established through the marriage alliances that began with Ishmael's wives. But the religious implications are perhaps even more profound. The preservation of monotheistic elements within Arabian tribal culture, despite centuries of polytheistic influence, created the conditions for Islam's eventual emergence and rapid expansion. The religious concepts that Muhammad drew upon weren't entirely new innovations. They represented the recovery and reformulation of spiritual traditions that had been maintained within Arabian society through generations of cultural transmission. The role of women in this transmission process, though often unrecognized in traditional historical accounts, was absolutely crucial. In tribal societies where oral tradition preserved essential cultural knowledge, women served as the primary transmitters of religious stories, cultural values, and social practices from one generation to the next. Ishmael's wives, whatever their specific identities, would have played central roles in shaping the religious and cultural environment within which their children were raised. The stories they told, the prayers they taught, the customs they maintained, the values they emphasized. All of these elements contributed to the formation of cultural traditions that would eventually influence the development of Islamic civilization. When the Quran speaks of the mothers of the believers, it's recognizing a pattern of female influence on religious development that extends back to the very foundations of Arabian spiritual life. Contemporary feminist scholarship has begun to recover some of these hidden histories, examining the ways that women's contributions to religious and cultural development have been systematically minimized or erased from traditional historical accounts. The mystery surrounding Ishmael's wife reflects broader patterns of historical amnesia regarding women's roles in shaping the political and spiritual institutions that continue to influence our world. But recovering these hidden histories isn't just an academic exercise or a political statement. It's essential for understanding how cultural and religious traditions actually develop and change over time. The emphasis on male lineages in traditional genealogical records obscures the crucial role that marriage alliances and cultural exchange played in creating the conditions for major historical transformations. When we recognize the significance of Ishmael's marriages in establishing the tribal confederations that would eventually produce Islamic civilization, we gain deeper appreciation for the complex processes through which divine purposes unfold through human choices and cultural developments. The contemporary relevance of this ancient story extends to current debates about immigration, cultural assimilation, and religious pluralism in societies throughout the world. The synthesis of Egyptian and Arabian elements that began with Ishmael's marriages provides a historical model for understanding how different cultural traditions can be integrated in ways that create new forms of social and political organization. The success of the tribal confederations that emerged from these marriage alliances demonstrates that cultural diversity can become a source of strength rather than division when it's managed through inclusive institutions and shared values. The commercial networks that connected diverse peoples across vast geographical distances required sophisticated systems of trust, cooperation, and mutual benefit that transcended narrow tribal loyalties. These historical precedents speak directly to contemporary challenges facing multicultural societies throughout the world. The processes of cultural integration that began with Ishmael's marriages offer insights into how different traditions can be woven together in ways that preserve valuable elements from each while creating new possibilities for cooperation and mutual flourishing. As we reach the conclusion of our investigation into this ancient mystery, we need to recognize that the question of Ishmael's wife represents something much larger than individual biography or genealogical curiosity. It represents the hidden foundations of civilizational development, the unseen influences that shape the course of human history, and the mysterious ways that divine purposes work through ordinary human choices to produce extraordinary historical consequences. The silence of Scripture regarding her identity might reflect the limitations of ancient, record-keeping systems that focused on male achievements while minimizing female contributions. But it might also represent something deeper, a recognition that the most significant influences on human history often operate through hidden channels, unrecognized processes, and anonymous individuals whose names are forgotten, even when their impact continues to shape our world. Today, as we face unprecedented challenges that require cooperation across cultural, religious, and national boundaries, the story of Ishmael's wives reminds us that our deepest differences often conceal our most fundamental connections. The tribal confederations that emerged from ancient Arabian marriage alliances created patterns of cultural exchange and political cooperation that enabled human flourishing across vast regions and extended time periods. The merchants who traveled the incense routes, the pilgrims who journeyed to sacred sites, the scholars who preserved and transmitted knowledge, the artists who created beauty that transcends cultural boundaries, all of them participated in networks of human connection that began with marriage alliances in the wilderness of Paran. The mystery of Ishmael's wife challenges us to look beyond the surface of contemporary conflicts and divisions to recognize the deeper patterns of connection and interdependence that shape our shared human story. Her unnamed presence in the biblical narrative reminds us that the most important influences on our world often operate through hidden channels that resist easy categorization or simple explanation. Whether we approach this story from the perspective of biblical scholarship, historical research, or contemporary political analysis, we encounter the same fundamental truth. Human history unfolds through complex processes of cultural exchange, marriage alliance, and spiritual development that connect us to each other in ways that transcend the boundaries of nation, tribe, and religious tradition. The 12 princes that emerged from Ishmael's lineage represent more than ancient tribal leaders. They represent the potential for human cooperation and cultural synthesis that continues to offer hope for addressing the challenges that face our contemporary world. As you reflect on this ancient mystery and its contemporary relevance, consider how the hidden connections revealed in the story might inform your understanding of current events, personal relationships, and spiritual questions. The woman whose name we'll never know continues to influence our world through the descendants of the marriages she helped arrange and the cultural traditions she helped establish. Her silent presence in the biblical narrative reminds us that the most significant influences on human history often operate through channels that resist recognition or easy explanation. But their effects continue to shape our world in ways that invite wonder, reflection, and deeper appreciation for the mysterious purposes that work through ordinary human choices to produce extraordinary historical consequences. The hidden root of Arab nations lies not just in ancient genealogies or political developments, but in the ongoing human capacity for cultural synthesis, spiritual insight, and cooperative endeavor. That began with marriage alliances in the wilderness and continues to offer possibilities for understanding and peace in our contemporary world. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of history's most intriguing mysteries. If this exploration has opened new perspectives on ancient stories and contemporary challenges, please share it with others who might benefit from these insights. Subscribe for more investigations into the hidden connections between biblical narrative and world history. And remember that the most important questions often lead us not to simple answers, but to deeper appreciation for the complex processes through which divine purposes unfold through human choices across the generations. The mystery continues, and so does its influence on our world.